And Fiona, it's fine to sit here in Oslo again. How long is it since we last met? 10 years? 12 years?
Well, we have seen each other since we first met, but we first met in 2003.
Because I saw Countenance at Documenta,
yeah.
And that made a staying impression on me. And 1 year after, I was asked to do this job at the Parliament, which was a new building at the Parliament, which was called for the hearing rooms. And at the Norwegian Parliament, they have a long tradition of documentary photography of all people in prominent political positions. And I thought that that might be an environment that could resonate to your way of working. So I contacted you, and
yeah.
I would say that was perhaps the beginning of Vox Populi Oslo.
That's right. So perhaps I should briefly try and describe Countenance, since it's not here in the exhibition.
Absolutely.
Countenance is a piece that I filmed in Berlin. I'm sorry, can you hear me? Understand me well? I keep on hearing this harmonic up there.
Sorry,
yeah. I lived in Berlin for a year with a DAD scholarship, and I took the opportunity to study photographs of a well-known old German photographer called August Sander. And he was working now 100 years ago, and he made what have become iconic black and white photographs of German citizens as part of a large project that he never finished called People of the 20th Century. And these photographs I like very much. And I went to Cologne, to the archives, and looked at them. And I found myself wondering, his photographs, for example, are like his really well-known photographs are of a pastry cook, or of a butcher, or of people in different professions. And I found myself wondering, if I do that again now, almost 70, 80 years later, does a pastry cook still look like a pastry cook? He does. I filmed it completely in Berlin because I was interested I was living in Berlin and very interested in Berlin and interested in the difference between East and West Berlin. And this piece I ended up showing for the first time in the Documenta, which is also in Germany. And that's how you got to see my work. And I had done it before, but I think this was the first time I did it in a really big way. I filmed over 200 portraits of people, but I filmed, they're like photographs, but they're filmed. So people are standing still for a minute, but the film is rolling. And it's very similar to what you see in this exhibition in Diptych. Provenance is kind of different because the camera is there moving. But I'm very, very interested in what I call photographic moments. So it's like a photo is being taken, but because the film is still rolling, time is passing, and it's a very different experience of looking at someone. You also see all their embarrassment and their uncomfortableness of being in front of a camera.
I would also like to say that when it made such an impression on me, it was also because of the voice.
Right.
The room before we entered the projections was filled with your voice.
Yes.
And I would say space occurred between the visuality and the spoken word, an immaterial space. And speaking of this period in German history, it's also a reference in Aby Warburg, who described the image, the particularity of the image, that it consists of movements that are frozen for a moment on the pictorial surface, but it is obviously there are big social, political, artistic movements outside of the image, but they come to rest for a while on the pictorial space. And this generative space, which is not seen, but which is suggested between your voice and these faces coming and going on the projection. I thought that highly original, so I would say, also quoting a famous photographer like August Sander, it was also something completely new there, which I wouldn't say I haven't seen it before, because it's part of being a human being, that you are in space and you have the psychological space. No? But to see it in art, to find that geography, which is not a physical geography, but a mental and psychological geography, I think that informs your work, and that is also part of it, which I really would like us to perhaps dig a little bit deeper in, if it's useful.
I'm really excited by this idea of off-screen. Quite often when I'm planning my shots and thinking about the work I'm working on, so the work that doesn't exist yet, it's maybe even more important what's going on outside the frame than what's going on inside the frame, because they both inform each other, and an image should always reach further. The other thing I was thinking about, it's because when I look at you, behind you, I see all these frames on the wall. Another thing is the aspect of the archive and of documents coming together to make an archive, which is something which goes in several directions with me, because I started as a student working quite a lot with existing archives and borrowing images from them. And now, increasingly, I find myself, if you like, building up my own little archives. And Countenance, when I was working on it, I thought of it like a library. So like a library of images where you can come, spend a bit of time, go away, come back again. And that's also a certain sort of space, I think, which is, I guess, also a very pregnant space. It's a very sort of space full of potential and possibilities. This archival thing, it continues and continues, because I have recent work called Inventory, and my most recent work is called Depot. An archive for me is not a dead thing. It's very much a starting point, I guess.
I would also say that in your work it becomes obvious that you don't have a privileged position in the archive. As an artist, you also yourself part of time passing. And in, for instance, Diptych, the twins from Gotland, I think it also becomes obvious that, okay, it's about the twins, it's about 5 years passing, but it's definitely also about Fiona Tan spending 5 years with an artistic concept of returning to Gotland and being in that situation of producing that work. And to me, that is also something that rescues, in a Benjaminian sense, a project from being trapped in, for instance, a post-colonial, well, that wouldn't be the risk exactly for that work, but frameworks which are really fixed politically, ideologically. I think I wouldn't say it gives you free space, but it certainly opens a field where the archive is generating and producing new meaning, and not necessarily manifesting already known political formulas or cupboards where you often put as an artist. So
Yeah. Well, there's lots of things I could say. One thing is that I'm learning this as I'm getting older and working with more and more archives and documents. I think when we say the word archive, we instantly almost have an image of like rows and rows of cabinets and drawers and everything perfectly organized. And reality of the archive is chaos. I have yet to meet an archive which is well organized. There's always something wrong. There's always something that doesn't fit. There's always something which has been put back in the wrong drawer. But actually, this is for me like then exciting because it's a possibility and things that are and yeah, that's the other thing of when you go to a library and you look for a particular book, but you end up taking not that book with you, but the book that was next to it. I think this is very important for creativity.
And it's also strange that the library is both a very personal place, but it's also a very public place.
Yeah.
And between the books, perhaps this public and the private kind of meets, and it generates also historical information, which is not given. But for instance, I will return to Warburg again. He says that what is archetypical of a period is not necessarily the archetypical information you find in the archives, but it is exactly as you mentioned, the lacking information, the illogical argument, the little dysfunction. And these become, perhaps 100 years later, or in the case of Rembrandt, 500 years later, these lapses, this lack of information on Nelly, for instance, who was she? But the lack of information who was Nelly, the daughter of Rembrandt as a person, that has generated that artwork.
Yeah. But
and so it is also, I would say, an archive's lack of information or possibility of falling apart is also constitutive of our understanding of what that archive is.
Yeah, and like he was saying, I don't want to lock meaning down into a very defined, unchanging situation. I'm more interested in opening things up, and it's not that I want to be vague. No, I want to be very precise, but I want to be generous as well. But when you were talking about Rembrandt, and I was thinking about countenance, that was reminding me about how time can be so incredibly elastic, because countenance I filmed in black and white, and in 2002, 2001, 2002, and it was very strange to watch the footage back, because it felt like it had actually already been filmed 20 years ago or something. There was a very strange time jump in the material already, even though it had just been filmed a week ago. I was looking at rushes and things. And I remember saying to people when I was showing it for the first time, and I was still a bit nervous about whether people would appreciate it or like it, I would sort of say, this work will be even better in 50 years' time. I hope so. But with Provenance, where I did a lot of research into the 17th century, first half of the 17th century, into painting, so maybe we should talk a bit about painting, since you're a painter. But for me, what was fascinating was how close history can be. I grew up in Australia, and Australia is always embarrassed of the fact that it has, at least from a Western point of view, not a long history. So a building which is 100 years old is really old, and obviously in Europe that's ridiculous. And in my very erratic research of history in Amsterdam, I was struck at how close and tangible history sometimes is. So, for example, there was one painting of a painter who's not well known. His name is Miereveld, and he painted of a woman, and she's a very strict-looking woman. She doesn't look friendly at all. But I was interested in her because there's an interest for me in the fact that the people who had themselves portrayed are not interested in having themselves portrayed to look beautiful or attractive. They don't mind if they look really tough and ugly. And so I wanted to find out more about this woman, and she had 8 children, and she came from the south, in Dordrecht, and her sons became very, very wealthy, and one of them moved to Amsterdam and built a really, really big, rich house. That house ended up becoming the first building of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and it ended up that it's now not the Rijksmuseum anymore, it's now the building of the Science Academy in Amsterdam. And one of the first exhibitions I did was in this building. And I showed a work in a room, which, as I then, 10 years later, found out was the antechamber to her son's bedroom. And they're not sure, but maybe her painting hung in that room where I showed my work. So it's like history is right here. You can touch it.
Speaking of which, then I have to tell a little anecdote.
Okay.
Because my receptance to compliments might be because I was very familiar with Menschen des 20. Jahrhunderts von August Aldo. And present among us today is the son of the person who posed for the painter in that album.
Really?
And that gentleman was the founding director of this museum. And his name is Jan Brockman, and he's sitting among the audience. Okay. So I think painting can be refound on the wall as a physical fact, canvas, oil paint, but as also Jenny Wahl writes in a wonderful text, I think, for your book, which she says that Nelly performs according to the strokes of her father, also suggesting that painting can be the score. And isn't that how we experience painting when we are in front of a painting? Kind of are invited to walk with the painter, a little walk on the canvas, how these traces have been put on the canvas. It's a physical fact, because I'm really interested also talking about physical facts, because this can be very speculative, philosophical, which I think both of us have a hunch to talk in that direction, but in the end, as an artist, you also arrest it. As Avi Warburg says, it comes down on the surface. It has to come down, because it has to communicate. And a good painting, what is a good painting? What functions? There are traces that actually are able to be played again as a score when you are in front of it. It's a constitutive moment where you become aware of yourself in front of the artwork as a person looking. And another artist that I invited together with you for the project in the parliament was Remit Saug. And Remit Saug, he died 5 years ago. But I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he worked very much with text paintings and addressing exactly that situation when you are in front of a work of art and you become aware of yourself looking at the work, which again constitutes the subject. So that is the object art gives the subject back, no? And that is the performative moment in painting. Painting is frequently looked upon as this historical event that comes from far away. But looking at the Rembrandt can be here now. And I think it's so wonderful in Nelly that you also, for instance, there's a scene there that Nelly runs to and forth like a bird in a cage.
Yeah.
And you hear rustling, you don't know if it's her cloth or her robe, or if it's outside. No? You're a little bit uncertain whether it's an inside sound or an outside sound. But she's like a bird in a cage, and she blends into the wallpaper and the fabric.
Yeah.
And to me, that is painting refound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, in Nelly, very important is this. I wanted her to be prisoner, right? So the interior space and the exterior environment suggested through sound. So you hear the sounds of the jungle, for example, because actually I filmed it in Amsterdam, but I imagine her in Indonesia. So how do you do that? And it's also, is she imagining herself in some ways? Like, is she like a writer writing? I was reading this morning about the Bildungsroman, so well, I have to stop there because then I'll get all literary. But this concept of writing the self, which is very strong in Bildungsroman.
But I would also say that the voiceover, of course, is a text. No? When we experience it here, we frequently, it's not transparent always that it's a text because we hear it.
Yeah.
But if you think of it as a continuum, this is a wall text in a museum. We can read about your work, no? But we can also hear your voice as an integral part of the artwork. And to some extent, unless you go to an exhibition where you know it's sound art, then you are kind of toned in to be very appreciative of that it's sound. But I think, and that's a question I actually would like to ask you, that I think frequently sound is underestimated when it comes to speaking of video art, for instance.
Yes.
I think it's haphazardly treated sometimes.
Yes. Yes, I agree, and it's for me something that I try always to be very, very precise about. It's nothing is unintended. So whether I work with sound or without sound, that's always very carefully decided. And sound works on such a different way. It's very nice that you asked me about sound and the voice and the space. And that reminds me of artists like Susan Phillips, who's actually a sculptor, about working with sound, which is a really, really interesting thing to do. And space and how I work with the space or with architecture is very important to me. So as an artist, I consider myself an exhibition maker. And that sounds maybe a silly thing to say, but I design my exhibitions also, and so how you encounter the works and how they are positioned in the space is also an important part for me of what I do. It's not the only thing I do. The works can also be existing apart from that, but it's talking about sound. Yeah. Kettle's boiling.
Speaking of sound.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very generous of you letting Gilberto Sordo into our conversation.
Yeah, it does mean that I've lost my train of thought now. I was talking about sound, yes, and you were suggesting that sound is not carefully enough. I just finished working on a feature film, and I think particularly in cinema, the importance of sound is underestimated. And that was something I noticed again. With sound, you can make or break a film.
And at the same time, of course, in Hollywood today, sound design has gone over the top now. You have this artificially made sound. So we have some soundtracks, for instance, someone lighting a cigarette, and you have a lighter and click, and the first, the sound, you know, when you, it's fetishism. So we're not talking about that kind of, I would say, over-emphasizing sound. It's also about sound having a function, a proper function.
Yeah.
Because I would say sound is really extremely treated these days in film, commercial film.
In film, yeah.
But I think it's not. It should be taken back by artists to actually. Of course, we have wonderful sound art. That's a terrible notion, but it makes sense. But in video and in film, I think it is as constitutive, as you say, as the images, and it also creates this in between, this immateriality, which. Then is constitutive in the end. Yeah. And I think just finishing that, coming back to painting, that when we talk about painting, we frequently also talk about objects. But it is also important to be reminded that a painting is not an object. And Abbe Warburg was very strict about that.
What is it then?
He said that it is a temporally arrest of movement. Mm-hmm. And I'm not quoting Abbe Warburg here as the witness of truth, but I'm really want to stress him here because I think it makes sense when I go through your exhibition here to also point at not just these physical sides between voice, between projection, between being an exhibition maker, as you say, but we also have a space around this museum, what we call the world, what we call context, and we probably also have to mention it because your biography, growing up where you did, etc., the framework of discussing your work has frequently been post-colonial, and it has been framed in this problematic. And I think that is a very important problematic, but it has to be refound in an artistic approach where art is the tools of bringing that, communicating that. So I would say access to the social, political, post-colonial frameworks, it's always to personal, even private spaces, like problems, where you find that space between your voice and the photography of the person evaporating and coming to sight, evaporating and coming to sight. So this, I guess I'm just suggesting that political, I mentioned, you said once, Kathleen David made a distinction between two kinds of politics, no? But it has to be refound in a personal approach.
Yeah, okay. But I mean, something I said to you before while we were preparing was that my biographies, you don't need to know my biography to look at my work. I don't think that's needed, and that's something that irritates me these days because the press somehow
that's a framing, no?
Grab that too easily. But for example, the piece which is now here in this room, but the sound is turned off, so it's not here in the room. The Changeling was for me very much more also just an experiment in terms of if you have one still image, but you have a text which I wrote and which I took a long time writing, how much can I, with these two things, two very simple things, a voiceover and a still image, juxtaposed to alternating images on the other side, how much can I push this image and push your reception of the image? And that's something that still interests me now. So, diptych doesn't have sound and it doesn't have text, but I think there it's much more an accumulative thing. The images you have to let the images build up, like sediments in a rock, and just sort of let them wash over you also to an extent. And then slowly you start thinking about the time and comparing, looking and comparing. And it's also like a luxury. We're lucky we have video and film that allows us to see 5 years in 2 minutes. And that's something that is very specific to this medium, which I like to exploit, I guess.
I would also say the way you orchestrate space, that you actually build these two these two different spaces physically, that's perhaps the farthest you have went in your physical orchestration of this difference. It's almost didactic that you actually split the...
Yeah, well, it's also, there's one twin on one side and the other twin on the other side, so it's like a deliberate schism, if you like, or like two hemispheres of the brain.
Two halves.
Two halves that you have to complete in your head. Yeah, so it's a deliberate frustration also.
But it also resonates with actually, you asked me to stress painting, and here I go again. painting on a wall, painting on a ceiling, painting in architecture historically. And what you do there, speaking very physically, is that you say, okay, a visual moment can also be ruled by architecture. You can actually build a wall, which prevents you from seeing it, but you know the image is there, no? Which is a very important thing if you think of early art. No? I was in Italy this summer, and early fresks from the 12th century to the 14th century. It's all about, or it's frequently about, painting being a very natural thing. We have some small fresks up here, which no, these are probably not painted. These are
ceramic.
Ceramic.
Yeah.
Because it used to be some paintings there by Norwegian artists actually, but they've taken them down. So these are the original ones. But what we call integrated art, or what we call art which is part of an architecture, and that's something I would like to parallel, because you're not making a film, and a commercial film.
Well, film for cinema, it's not commercial.
No, it's not commercial, but you have a hell of a lot of work to do to raise money for it, and it was really...
Yeah.
So in that sense it was, because it's a big production. But what I'm heading at is working as an artist with architecture and architectural elements, or working with a film that big context. Then you kind of step a little bit out of, I wouldn't say comfort zone, but you gain perhaps a bigger audience, or you gain a broader discussion of your work. But at the same time, you leave a context. I wouldn't say it's exclusive, but it's also about artistic control. And how do you see that? Is it possible today, very direct question, is it possible today to keep the visual, mental and psychological urgency of your work in that film?
Well, I tried my goddamn best.
Oh.
I worked on this film for 3 years. It hasn't come out now, so I'm sort of a bit in limbo, because it is like technically finished, and it will premiere at early next year, and then it will be released in cinemas. I don't know if it's coming to Norway, so let's hope that there's a distributor here who wants to show it.
You have a very good cinematheque, probably.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's the difficult thing. I felt that I was trying something impossible, because I said to myself at a certain point, okay, I will adhere to the rules of making a cinema movie. So that means you have a certain length. It means, for example, it's just on one screen. I've also shot many films in a vertical format, so, all that sort of stuff I can't do.
And the contract with the audience is different?
The contract with the audience is very different, and the whole way that economically things run is different. But I still hope that I said I want to make film, and I want to make a film which works as a film in the cinema, and I want to make art. And I think that's actually almost impossible. I hope somehow I've managed that. But I don't know, I think that will be for everyone to decide when they see it themselves. But I really, really did try and do that.
But it kind of crossed my mind that the structure you built there for the twins, suggesting a historical link to architecture and visual art, painting, frescoes, frieze, and the structure of making a 90-minute movie is entering a different space, a different also psychological space than the more intimate approach that we see in many of your works.
Yeah.
And as an artist, I think it's also interesting to be reminded that the birth, you could talk about the birth of painting, it had a kind of natural thing that, could you decorate this wall? It was integrated, it was used. It was an image on a wall. It was, you painted, you wanted the sky, I paint the sky for you, or a religious thing. So these complications, of course, that we experience today is also, of course, because art became a special area, right? It kind of removed itself from... So if we are to talk about art in a social context, it's definitely also to dare, as an artist, to approach, not to get dirty on your hands, but to have self-assurance that I can enter this world and I can keep my integrity as an artist. And I said, we discussed it over lunch a couple of days ago, and I said, it is as if you have prepared for doing a film.
Yeah.
I can't agree, though.
Yeah, I agree, because the way I produce many works is very similar in terms of like the productional side of things. Is quite similar. So in that way, I've been rehearsing for it. I think I want to say something about art, which is going to sound really stupid, but sometimes you have to say stupid things, I guess. I think art, that sort of art that I make is about images, and it's about looking at images and thinking about images, and I think that is something really stupid and really simple. And if my work can manage that simplicity, you walk into a space, you see an image in front of you, then it's okay.
Yeah.
And, we can get all complicated about economics and art market and galleries and all this, stuff that we deal with these days, but when it comes down to it, it's that we as animals are very strongly visually orientated. We are also very social, communicative animals, so voice and language and sound is also all part of what I choose to work with. Yes, somehow it should be incredibly simple. I think that's kind of all I can say in that sense. And I would hope that some of my works are that sometimes. There's another thing about time, and that's a really nice thing for me. The very well-known cliche of you never step into the same river twice. And I'm very aware of that what I work with is electronic time, and so that is time arrested. But actually it's never the same, because every time you see it, or it's someone else seeing it, or it's a different context, or I'm different. So that's a mirror which is always giving me different answers. And that's something that I very much enjoy being able to work with as an artist.
Which also resonates with the simplicity of the image that you were talking about, because what you're referring to now is quite complex. It's new every time. It's a performative side of images. But
Okay,
if the image, I think that's an important point. Because if the image is quiet, then it also gives you a quiet in the sense that you described it now. It can be quite hectic, but it's a simple experience of entering a room with a painting in it or a visual expression in it. But in the end, it's not that simple, because you become aware of yourself as looking, and it's performative, it changes every time you see it. And I would say to make that happen today, is it possible to trust the image to do that, or do you need help of architecture, of text? So do you still believe in the image having that power to?
Yeah,
that's wonderful.
Definitely. Even though I do all this work, get all these walls built, all this painted, I do my utmost to try and create exhibitions and spaces and lighting conditions and all the rest of it to enable people to see the work as I think they should see it. I see that as part of my job. But it's kind of funny, because now I'm contradicting myself, aren't I? Because I'm saying I believe in the image, and the image should do it all on its own, and here I am working away. Yeah. I'll go and figure that one out.
But I would say that the daily practice as a painter, to have your material, you have a brush and you have oil color, and work in oil color mainly.
I want to ask you a question, and then maybe
okay.
we'll ask if
Is
you
it
want to
related
ask
to oil color and brushes?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
How do you start painting?
Which painting?
Painting. Your painting.
How it is painted?
No, how do you start?
How I start with a painting? Well, I start with a physical, or I have an idea what it should be, of course. So it is
because for me, you're quite a conceptual painter. You're not a painter.
No, but it is about. I have to be very specific. For instance, for a period, I repaint some modernist iconic works, or Malevich, for instance, or Elisitsky, existing works. And why do I repaint them? Well, it's related to what we just described, that in front of a work, it's a performative aspect. You think you know what it is, but something has to happen. It generates something. And in order to understand what the black square is on Malevich, I still think it's valid to take on the task to paint it. And that's again a bit stupid. It's stupidity, it's simplicity. But it's not so stupid after all, because, okay, it's a bit boring to... You know, you go to a studio on Tuesday morning, and today I make the black square on Malevich. That's the concept. You ask me how I do it. That's the concept. And then I go and do it. And then, of course, I haven't painted that.
Yeah, do you succeed?
No, I haven't succeeded when the evening comes. I haven't.
So you're a failure?
I'm a failure. I'm a total failure. But I go on the next day, and I can give myself, for instance, tasks like, okay, there's some cracks in the black, which is traces of history. I know intellectually that these cracks were made by Malevich. But for my appreciation of Malevich today, that's part of the aesthetic and also the historical experience of that work. Then it becomes complicated. Then it's absolutely not so head-on stupid any longer. Then I really have to relate to that crack. Do I paint that crack? Can I paint it, or do I do it technically? Do I make a monochrome and some technical thing that makes it crack? No, that's too stupid. I mean, this complication.
Is that a rehearsal? I mean, is it something for you? At what point should someone see it?
They have actually been shown in context where I think they can support my argument, which is actually that I think people should love them when they see them. That they think they know what it is, and at the same time you don't recognize what it is. You know? It's something very familiar, and at the same time you don't recognize it. And I think it's a wonderful moment in Nelly when you dare to go so close to Vermeer. Because I remember the first talk we had in your studio, we had a wonderful little card of the woman reading a letter in the studio. And I said, maybe it's time to take it down now. Maybe you said that, I had it here for ages. Maybe it's time to take it down. And now I come and see Nelly, and I see you have gone so close to Vermeer. And I think the risk also of loving your darlings, or going extremely deep into what interests you, is also perhaps a very radical thing to do. I'm not interested in it as radicality, but if you ask me why paint, how do you start, it's something that perhaps I think I know very well. I think I might be, it's almost in my pocket. But no, I don't know it, no, because I have to go through it, and it doesn't come from so far away. It's very close, but you work through it, and then you see how complicated it is.
Okay, now I have another question for you, and then I'll stop. But it was something that a journalist asked me, was it yesterday or the day before? She said, and actually I wonder if it's true, I should have challenged her. I always think of good replies 2 days later when I'm interviewed. She said, I am sometimes accused of, I think she said, opulent beauty.
Is that an accusation?
Well, I said to her, what's wrong with beauty? But now I want to ask her who said that. But I wanted to ask you, what about beauty? Should work be beautiful? Is your work beautiful? Do you strive for beauty?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, there we have it.
But I also have to add something.
I don't think I do,
No, but
actually.
because you had this discussion in the 80s, you know, when it was so radical that beauty came back. The sublime came back, and the beauty came back, and it was radical. Now, but if you with beauty mean, for instance, in front of a Vermeer, but it could also be in front of, or after film. See, we talked about Ingmar Bergman, and there's some films with Ingmar Bergman where I think he gets so close to the human face. And that has a beauty to me, and I would say it's not necessarily an art beauty, it's life beauty. So I would say, if you ask me about beauty in art, I wouldn't reserve it for art. I would say I am interested in beauty in art if it can remind me of the beauty in life. And Agnes Martin has a very beautiful, very simple lecture she held where she talks about beauty and art. And but again, to your work, Fiona, when I see the foot of your son, you're very upfront, it is your son, and I think that's also the daring thing, but I see the foot of your son, and on that foot is a little wound. And I think that's come from a sandal. If you, I also have a sandal, it's a little sore you get here because you have some summer sandals that makes a little sore here, you know, in the skin, a little dysfunction in the skin. And that, to me, was a moment of beauty. Mm-hmm. So if you talk about beauty, then I have to say a lot, but yes, if it's like that, not grandeur beauty.
No, it's funny, I don't think about beauty very much. I don't even think I strive for it, which sounds silly. I do and I don't. For example, I think it's very important that I light my work as well as I can. And like light, it's funny, we've been trying to talk about space and time, and actually we should also talk about light. Because light is I can't do anything without light. And you need light to take photos and to film.
The shocking moment, really shocking good moment, is the laptop. The laptop as a source of light. You're actually looking into a laptop, and we don't think of it because we're sitting and looking in lamps most of the time, and our faces are lit, but we think that we are kind of we're scrolling, and we're in some, but we're sitting there on a stage with the light, and then you have 380. 380 doesn't exist, 360. You see, that's the difference between two dimensions and 3 dimensions and 2 dimensions. But you go around, and then it's so fantastic when we see that there is a window and the sunlight comes through. Because when I see the first shot, because I saw it for the first time today, or yesterday, and then I thought this is about the only source of light in that room is the laptop. That's really good, I thought. And then you go, and then the sunlight comes in. That was an argument in light, which said something about our time, 2015, but also the conditions of that. And that was Vermeer and the technical production of the work. So Vermeer is not just only a woman reading a letter in front of a window, of course, it's also refound in that.
Yeah. But light is maybe like sound. You don't think about it, but it has to be light. Should we
open for questions? Oh yes, we already talked for a moment.
Does anyone want to? You don't have to, but we don't buy it.
I'm just curious to know that how did you collect the photos for these works?
Good question. Actually, we're very lucky today because sitting with us is Jan Hofer, who helped me for months in collecting all the photo albums for making Vox Populi Norway, which is the first time I did this. And that was then like the framework that I have used every time. So I do a bit of simple research into the place and try to find out very loose statistics about the population. And then I sort of put together a list, and it's approximately 100 people or 100 families who we then one by one approach, so that was all young doing that, and asking them if they would be prepared to borrow, to lend to me their photo albums. And so it was important to me that it's not haphazard and not accidental. So, for example, we never put an advertisement in a newspaper because I think you get certain sorts of people wanting to show me certain sorts of photos. Whereas I wanted to have some rich people, some poor people, some normal people, some all different sorts. And I've tried to do that in every single city or country.
They were like physical
albums. Yes, yeah. Sounds surprising now, but 10 years ago that was still quite normal.
Hello? Yeah, I just want to ask you what you think the meaning of an image is today. Because
Whoa.
That's something I really wonder now that we have internet, especially my really young generation. We see so much images every day, and I wonder, like, where's the position of the art, and what does an image, an artistic image, come in, and what does it mean today?
Mm-hmm. Really, really tough question, but it's a really good one to ask. I think I probably ask myself this all the time. Something that I ask myself is, where does the image live? And in terms of, it's also like, where is the art? Recently I made a work called Inventory, which was thinking about the medium. And if you think in terms of sculpture, that's quite simple. The medium is the stone or the wood, but also in sculpture you have copies, you have casts, plaster casts, and you can't have an image without a medium. And we forget this. We, particularly in this digital age where we tend to think of images as being less and less physical, it needs to have a carrier, whatever the carrier is. I'm not answering your question. I'm not trying to avoid it, but it's just really hard to answer. Maybe the professor can.
Of course, I will elaborate. I'll give you the answer. No, I think about physicality, I think it was spot on. Just is looking in this laptop, being lit. You are lit. These are electrodes coming into your face. It's quite dramatic what happens there.
Yeah, but her question, which I also didn't answer, is what is it?
Yeah, but that is an image. It's physical.
Mm.
You made that image, but it wouldn't have been possible to make that image without that medium.
Mm.
So I think it might sound like a tautological, a rose is a rose as a physical, but today we forget the rose, you know? We have a tautology where we make the object of the tautology invisible. And I think it's absolutely correct, as you say, that an image is carried by something.
Yeah, I'll make a comparison. I'm not sure if it will help, but I'll make it anyway. I used to think about language. For some reason I think it less these days, but I used to think about it a lot before. I used to wonder, can you think without language? And the reason why I found myself wondering that had to do with when you learn a new language and you eventually manage to speak in a different language, there is a period when you're confused because you can't choose which language to work in, you know. And so you're either translating or you're tongue-tied because you know what you want to say, but it's not there. That is very interesting, I found. And I think we can think without language. I think we can. And I think part of that is visual also. Or I think it's too easy to say that visual is also a language. I think it is, but it's more than that. But what's for sure is I can't speak without a language. I can't write without a language. And that is again then getting towards this thinking about medium. And for an artist, I'm somehow presuming you're an art student, maybe you're not, but let me pretend you're an art student. The choice of medium is very important. And you're right, you are free to choose whatever medium you want to choose, but I think it's good to think about it. And not just paint because you've always painted, or photograph because you have a camera.
Hello. First, I want to thank you for this interesting conversation, where you put some, where you highlight some concepts that, of course, you're not going to go deep here, but you talk about photography and archive, about light that is very, very important for you. The opposite is to be the complete darkness, about sound, and maybe it's interesting that we can hear the noise of the sound. And you speak about painting, but is for me a very different media support from photography to painting. And one thing that you talk that I found still nowadays very important is the question of the archive. Mm-hmm. And you start to talk about Alexander, that is of course an uncompleted work, and many of them was destroyed. And I wanted to, because for me your work has a very strong sociological aspect in your work, when you are, let's say, mapping a fragment of the society, and all the, if you have the work and the visual literacy to go forward each image, to see each image that became from the public from the private to the public audience. Some of them have as a rich information about cars, about dress, and about, well, hundreds of aspects, and is what makes the work for me very rich from the, let's say, the aesthetical point of view, the creation, create your path. And so all these aspects from the sociological point of view are very, very strong in each work. We can face different societies, Japanese one, for instance, Nordic, or if you go to South countries, Mediterranean countries, or Arabic countries, you're going to find, and more the work will be rich about this visuality and experience. So I wanted to know how far you want to go with this work.
Okay. Well, it's very. Thank you for saying that, because it's nice, because it's something we didn't touch upon. And I think it's very nice that you said that, because also thinking about sociological things, so not only one person, but everyone we're living with, that is then actually geography, I guess. Because geography is not only the physicality of a landscape, it's the fact that people are there. And that's very, very true, that I mine out of this. just in very simple terms, I've made 5 times this work, if you like, in Norway, in Tokyo, in London, in Sydney, and in Switzerland. Switzerland's not here. And London is the last one I did, and I said it will be the last one. I've stopped. I think there are several reasons why, and they're all valid. Firstly, it's wonderful to do, but it's also incredibly tiring to look and choose all these images. And I noticed that it became heavier for me to do. And so I don't want to do it because I think I have to, or because someone's asked me to. And the other thing is that photography has changed. And this is very much then a time document. And I didn't realize when I started on Photographic Norway, but it is very much so. In the 12 years or whatever it is, 10 years that I've been working on these projects, photography has become digital. That's it. So photo albums are not being made anymore, and we're not choosing images anymore. And you will notice that it's always color photography that I choose. So it's also an era. It's the era of when the compact camera became available for consumers, and it became affordable, and everyone started having photo albums. And it's also like my time also. As a child, I looked a lot in photo albums. And now that time has passed, and now it's different. I'm not saying, I'm not nostalgic about it in that, it's just the way it is. So it's good also to finish things sometimes, I think. It's kind of ironic because, of course, now everyone's coming with me, can you please do one of Brazil, and can you please do one of... And I say, nope. But that's the way it goes.
Okay, I think I'd like to thank you both, especially you, Fiona, for a deeply interesting insight and generous insight into your work. And thank you, Dag Erik, for framing really questions, questions. And thank you to all of you, both for questions and showing up or enjoying being with us here today in this artist talk.
And I would also like to thank Fiona for inviting me for this speech, because I invited you to make work for the Norwegian Parliament, which is the reason I was sitting here. But you also wanted to have this artist talk today, and I think that is also a wonderful collegial thing between two artists that you actually can have, but that we really keep the contact. It's not just about creating this one work, but we continue our dialogue and conversation. Sometimes it's also really good that some years pass and we see that we stay on the ball. We are doing our stuff and we persist, and that is also I think it's sociological, has a sociological impact. So sociology is not always political in the big political sense, but it's also inherent in an artist's I would say lifespan, engagement in art, and I think your work is, of course, something that really reminds us of this element, and I think that is a very important tenor in contemporary art. So thank you.
Thank you. There's a